Actually, it's interesting. Sounds rather sort of bizarre, but I did go to Diana's coffin the day after I'd written it.
The innocence about her, you just thought, wow, this girl is knockout.
There are moments in history that the world never forgets. Moments so raw, so devastating, that even decades later, the mere mention of them brings a flood of emotion rushing back. The death of Princess Diana on August 31st, 1997, was one of those moments. But while the world mourned publicly, there was one man who carried a grief far more personal, far more complicated, and far more angry than most people ever knew. That man was Charles Spencer, Diana's younger brother, and for years, he has been speaking truths that the royal establishment wished would simply disappear into silence. What Charles Spencer has revealed over the years is not just the story of a grieving brother. It is the story of a man who watched his sister suffer, who tried to protect her, who was lied to, ignored, and ultimately overruled at every turn. His words have left the public stunned, the media rattled, and the royal family forced to confront a legacy they would rather rewrite. This is the story that Spencer has been telling, and it is one that the world deserves to hear fully. To understand why Charles Spencer's revelations carry such extraordinary weight, you have to go back to the beginning. Diana Frances Spencer was not born into royalty. She was a girl from an aristocratic English family, shy, warm, and entirely unprepared for what awaited her. When she married Prince Charles in 1981, she stepped into a world of rigid protocol, cold tradition, and ruthless expectation. She was 19 years old. Charles Spencer watched his sister transform from a vibrant, hopeful young woman into someone who was slowly being consumed by a system that had no interest in her emotional well-being. Spencer has spoken in interviews about how Diana confided in him during the darkest periods of her marriage. She would call him crying, telling him she felt completely alone inside the palace walls. She described a life of isolation, where she was expected to perform publicly while being ignored privately. The warmth she showed the world was real, but it existed in spite of her circumstances, not because of them. Spencer always made this point clearly. Diana's compassion, her connection with ordinary people, her extraordinary humanity, none of that came from the monarchy. It came entirely from within herself. The royal family, in Spencer's view, never truly accepted her. From the early years of her marriage, Diana was treated as an accessory rather than a person. When her marriage to Prince Charles fell apart, the institution did not rally around her or offer protection. Instead, she was pushed further and further to the margins. Even after her divorce was finalized in 1996, Diana remained one of the most photographed and pursued women on the planet. She had no security detail funded by the palace. She had no institutional protection. She was left entirely exposed to a media machine that had decided she was fair game around the clock, every single day. Spencer has never forgiven this. In his eyes, the royal family knew exactly what Diana was facing. They were aware that the press was hunting her relentlessly. They understood that she was vulnerable, and yet, the decision was made to look away, to distance the institution from the complications she represented, and to let her navigate that impossible world alone. For Spencer, this was not merely a failure of judgment. It was a moral failure of the deepest kind. Then came the night that changed everything. In the early hours of August 31st, 1997, a car carrying Diana crashed at high speed inside the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. The vehicle had been speeding in an attempt to escape pursuing photographers. The crash was catastrophic. Diana survived initially, but sustained injuries that proved fatal. She was pronounced dead in the early hours of the morning. Charles Spencer received the news by telephone in South Africa, where he had been living at the time. He has described those moments in shattering detail. The first call came in the middle of the night, informing him that Diana had been in a serious accident and was in hospital. Spencer sat with that information, hope still fragile but present. He knew about the dangers she faced from the press. He had worried about it for years. The second call arrived not long after, and with it came words that collapsed his world entirely. His sister was gone. Spencer has said that in those first moments, he felt a grief unlike anything he had experienced. But alongside that grief burned something else. Fury. He knew who had been chasing her car that night. He knew the culture that had made her the most hunted woman in the world. And he knew that the very people who should have protected her had chosen not to. That anger has never fully left him, and it has shaped every public statement he has made about Diana in the nearly 3 decades since her death. The days between Diana's death and her funeral on September 6, 1997, revealed something deeply troubling about the institution of the monarchy. As the nation erupted in grief, with flowers piling up outside Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace in quantities never seen before, the royal family retreated behind the walls of Balmoral Castle in Scotland. For days, there was nothing. No public address from the Queen. No national statement of mourning. The flag above Buckingham Palace remained at full mast, a detail that felt to many like a deliberate act of indifference. The public's grief quickly began to turn into something sharper. Newspapers that had always shown deference to the monarchy started asking direct and uncomfortable questions. Where was the Queen? Why was there no acknowledgement of what the nation was feeling? Why were Charles and the boys not in London, visible and present among the people who were devastated? It was only after days of mounting pressure, when it became clear that the monarchy's silence was actively damaging public trust, that the Queen finally addressed the nation. On September 5th, she spoke of Diana as a remarkable human being and praised her devotion to her sons. The words were appropriate, but for many people, they arrived too late. The silence that had preceded them had already said far more. Perhaps the most painful revelation that Charles Spencer has made concerns what happened in the planning of Diana's funeral. When the arrangements were being discussed by palace officials, it was decided that Prince William and Prince Harry would walk behind their mother's coffin in the funeral procession. William was 15 years old. Harry was just 12. When Spencer was informed of this plan during a conversation with a Buckingham Palace courtier, his response was immediate and absolute. He refused. The thought of 2 boys barely past childhood, still raw with the shock of losing their mother, being placed in front of billions of watching eyes and expected to walk that procession with composure, struck him as something no loving institution would ever ask of grieving children. He said it plainly. Diana would never have wanted this for her sons. But the palace was unmoved. Spencer pushed back, argued his case, and demanded reconsideration. He pointed out that it was cruel, that it was unnecessary, and that the eyes of every camera in the world would be trained on those boys, dissecting every expression, every trembling lip, every struggle to hold back tears. His protests were met with a response that contained no room for debate. The decision had been made. Then came the moment that Spencer has described as the thing that finally silenced his resistance. He was told that William and Harry themselves had expressed a desire to walk in the procession, that they wanted to do it. For Spencer, this changed the entire conversation. He would not force his nephews away from something they had chosen of their own will. Reluctantly, and with a grief of his own, he stepped back. It was only years later that the truth emerged. Harry, in his own words, confirmed that neither he nor his brother had been given any real choice. They were told what would happen. A 12-year-old boy does not refuse a directive from the institution that controls every aspect of his life. Harry walked behind his mother's coffin because he was told to walk, and Spencer, who had believed he was honoring the boy's wishes, realized he had been manipulated into withdrawing his objection. On September 6th, The world watched as that procession moved through the streets of London. The images of William and Harry, pale-faced and silent, walking behind their mother's coffin while the crowd wept around them, became among the most iconic and heartbreaking photographs of the 20th century. Spencer walked beside them. He has said that on that walk, the pain he felt was not only for the loss of his sister, but for the injustice of what those children were being made to endure. When Spencer stepped to the podium inside Westminster Abbey to deliver his eulogy, the world held its breath. What followed was one of the most extraordinary speeches ever delivered at a state funeral. Spencer did not speak in polished, diplomatic language. He spoke from a place of unguarded truth, and the effect was electrifying. He described his sister as the most hunted person of the modern age. He spoke of the cruelty of a media culture that had pursued her without mercy and without conscience. He challenged the institutions that had failed to protect her, and then he made a declaration that no one inside that Abbey could ignore. He pledged that Diana's blood family, the Spencers, would always be present in the lives of William and Harry, that they would do everything in their power to ensure those boys retained the qualities their mother had poured into them: imagination, warmth, and a deep connection to the real world beyond palace gates. The crowd inside Westminster Abbey broke into applause, an almost unheard-of response at a funeral of this solemnity. Outside, along the streets, where loudspeakers carried the service, the cheering was audible. Spencer had said what millions of people were feeling, but had no voice to express. He had stood in the most formal setting imaginable and spoken an unadorned truth. The royal family listened in silence. Spencer would later acknowledge, with characteristic honesty, that the promise he made in that eulogy proved impossible to fully keep. William and Harry were embedded within the royal system in ways that no amount of good intention from the Spencer family could alter. The monarchy held authority over their lives, their education, their public roles, and their futures. There was no mechanism by which their uncle could remove them from that orbit or raise them as their mother might have wished. His words had been a declaration of intent and of love, but the reality of institutional power meant that intent and love were not always enough. This admission, rather than diminishing Spencer's credibility, reveals the honesty with which he has always approached his sister's story. He has never dressed up the truth to make himself appear more heroic. He tried, he was lied to, he was overruled, and he has said so plainly that willingness to speak without vanity is precisely what makes his account so powerful and so important. The echoes of everything Spencer described did not fade with time. They grew louder. Harry, who as a 12-year-old boy had walked behind his mother's coffin without being given a choice, grew into a man haunted by what he had witnessed and experienced. He spoke openly in later years about the trauma of that funeral, about the years of grief he suppressed because the culture around him demanded silence, and about the pattern he eventually recognized. The same forces that had isolated Diana, the press hostility, the institutional indifference, the absence of protection, were beginning to close around his own wife, Meghan. In 2020, Harry and Meghan made the decision to step back from their roles as senior members of the royal family and relocate to the United States. The decision sent a shockwave through the institution, but for those who had been listening closely to